Have you ever wondered why choppy animation sometimes feels better? Some of you out there are going to immediately disagree, but think of it this way. Animation is not as simple as the frame rate of a video game. Your average video game is usually between 24 frames a second and 60 frames a second, but games will usually try to keep it consistent. If the game is optimized, it's always going to try and be 24 FPS, 30 FPS, 60 FPS, whatever. It stays a consistent, solid number of frames per second. But animation changes frame rate all the time without you noticing. On average, animation tends to be at a maximum of 24 frames a second, but it's rare for animation to even be at 24 frames a second the whole time. Usually it'll be half of that at 12 frames a second, and even drop down to 8 FPS or even 6 FPS. This is referred to as animating on 1s, 2s, 3s, and 4s, which is referring to how many frames the drawing is held for. Take a look at this scene from Cowboy Bebop. Nobody would call a fight like this choppy, but while most of the fight is on 2s, or 12 frames a second, there are moments where the animation is at a mere 8 frames a second or on 3s. Here's 2 frames from that fight. Look at how huge the jump is between them. These 2 drawings are held on 3s, at 8 frames a second. You can see it in the background, which is still moving at 24 frames a second. Holding these drawings for just a frame longer on 3s makes them more impactful and more readable compared to the rest of the shot, which is animated on 2s. The huge jump between these 2 frames wasn't an accident, and neither is the fact that they're held on for just a frame longer than every other frame. It's to make sure you feel those frames in the moment and feel what happens between those 2 frames. When it comes to animation, it's often more important what happens between frames more so than what's happening in a single frame. Because all that matters is how the animation feels as a whole, not what it looks like frame by frame. And sometimes what makes the animation feel better is holding on certain frames. Think about it this way. Imagine an arrow hitting a bullseye. How many frames do you think that takes? 3 frames? 2? What about 0? Nothing's there, and then it suddenly appears, with the tail vibrating into place. To me, this feels far more impactful than animating the frames in between. Because at the end of the day, animation itself is an illusion. Nothing is actually moving, it's your brain inserting the movement between those 2 frames. So the lack of anything between those 2 frames results in a far greater impact, with your brain filling in all the motion. Now, this isn't some hard and fast rule. American animation tends to animate fast movements on 1s, using smears and multiples for cartoony effect, while Japanese animation will focus more on the after effects of the action, putting emphasis on what's not there in a single frame, or what comes after. Both styles can be executed well, but what you prefer is ultimately up to you. Personally, I find the quote-unquote choppy animation far more satisfying, and I think when it's done well, people prefer it that way. I know I literally just said that what you prefer is up to you, but hear me out for a second. Before the 2000s, animation made for TV limited the amount of frames drawn as an economical decision. Studios only have so much time, labor, and materials for hundreds of hours of animation, so every frame mattered, and they emphasized the impact of an action over the action itself. That's why you get these flashes of white in Dragon Ball Z. Having them there for just a frame makes the impact feel way tougher. But over time, those economical decisions shifted as new technology made animation more convenient. After the 2000s, TV animation slowly began to focus on 2D puppet animation, or what a lot of people would know as flash animation, where all those in-between frames ended up being filled in by interpolation, and animation was often at a full 24 frames a second. But 2D puppet animation can be executed just as well as the more limited, choppier animation of the 90s. And using interpolation to your advantage and having every frame animated can be just as strong as a stylistic choice as hand animating on 2s and 3s. Obviously, I'm a fan of the style, hence why Doodly is animated this way. But what fascinates me is the recent trend we've been seeing that mixes the 2 together. Digital animation that can interpolate, but animators choose to limit the animation to 2s and 3s for that impact we were talking about earlier. And I think this style is fantastic. In my opinion, if you were wondering why the frame rate drops in Puss in Boots 2 look so good, this is why. And it works so unbelievably well that I think this is just where digital animation in general is going, and I kinda love it. When I said earlier that people prefer it this way, it's that I think people want to see an artist's decisions like this. When an animator is holding on a frame like this, they want you to feel it. You don't get that from fully interpolated digital animation. And that decision making, deliberately choosing what frames to hold on and for how long, is exactly the kind of reasons why people love classic 2D animation. It gives animation a soul. A lot of people criticize Flash animation for being hollow and too digital, and while I think Flash animation can be done well, like I've mentioned before, I've always seen people praise good Flash animation when they limit the frame rate like this, because they want to feel the artist behind it, not the computer. And the thing is, doing it this way is actually harder than fully interpolated 24 frames a second animation, especially in 3D. In an article for Polygon, the director of The Bad Guys has actually described it as fighting the computer. which is a pretty good way to describe it. Animators and artists are literally fighting against what the computer gives them to add their own touch to it. Nobody's cutting corners or doing it this way because it's cheaper. It requires far more artistic input and decision making. Most of all, it requires confidence, and I think that should be celebrated. It's risky and difficult and experimental, yet confident that it works anyways. Maybe it doesn't work for you, and that's okay, that's what an experiment is for. But 3D animation is still a fairly young medium that really only started 25 years ago, so we're still figuring it out. I've gone most of this video without mentioning Spider-Verse, and you've probably been vibrating in your seat waiting for it to get mentioned. But yeah, it really can't be understated how revolutionary Spider-Verse was for 3D animation. I know it can feel like studios are doing what Spider-Verse did because it's trendy, but I don't think that's the case. I think what Spider-Verse did instead was unlock something nobody realized they wanted in digital animation: to fight the computer. After 20 years of movies and TV that leaned into what the computer can do, we're finally leaning back into what the artist can do. And I think that's awesome. At the end of the day, I'm personally a huge fan of animating on 3s, 4s, and beyond, and I love seeing it in animation. Aside from the economical reasons that make it ideal for animating by yourself, because you have to draw far less frames, you can get some excellent fluid animation in just a handful of drawings when you know exactly what drawings to emphasize and how long to hold on to them for. You don't need to draw every single frame to get an idea across, just the most important ones, and then use classical techniques like overshoot and smears to really emphasize the motion. But that's for another video. Hopefully you'll leave this video a little more appreciative of the kinds of decisions that go into animating this way. I personally can't wait to see more of it in animation, and I hope you do too. Thanks for watching. This video was made possible with my Patreon subscribers at patreon.com/doodly. I don't take sponsorships, so it's currently the best way to support me, and you'll get access to an exclusive channel on our Discord server, lots of extra content and behind the scenes, and your name in videos. Thank you again to Burden Hunter, Alamaris, CGTS Films, Just Nero, TurboDev, Banana Man, Inker J, Eric Richter, Hobqueer, as well as the names you see scrolling now. Remember to do the usual YouTube stuff, and have a good one. Bye!